Kickapoo River Bend, Wisconsin, October, 1877. The air, smelling of damp earth and decaying leaves, carried the first premonition of winter. Along the river, where the current slowed to a thoughtful curve, stood the husk of the old grist mill. Its water wheel was long gone. Its roof, a skeleton of rotted timbers open to the sky, but its walls, 4 feet of solid limestone, remained. And inside this stone cylinder, a man named Callum Drake was working. He wasn't repairing it. He was moving in. He chipped away at the crumbling mortar between the massive stones, his hammer and chisel ringing with a patient, rhythmic clarity. Neighbors, leading their wagons down the rutted track to the valley floor, would stop and watch the strange Scotsman. They saw him mixing a plaster not of mud and straw, but of lime and sand, and applying it with a trowel to the vast curved interior. Ferris Oldknow, the county's grist mill assessor, made a special trip. He was a man whose world was made of straight lines and right angles, of ledger books and property deeds. He stood with his hands on his hips, his face a mask of professional pity. "Drake," he said, his voice loud enough to carry over the scrape of the trowel, "this is foolishness. You're plastering a ruin." Callum paused, wiped a smear of white from his brow with the back of his forearm, and looked at the assessor. He said nothing. "You think a bit of plaster will keep out the damp?" Oldknow pressed on, gesturing with his chin toward the old weir. "Come the March thaw, that river will back up. Water will push right through that foundation. It'll wick up that porous stone like oil up a lamp wick and rot every timber you drive into it. You'll be living in a damp, cold tomb. It's a mad idea." Callum Drake dipped his trowel into the bucket, collecting a neat triangle of fresh plaster. "The stone will be dry," he said, his voice quiet, and turned back to his work. The rhythmic scrape and tap resumed, a sound of serene, unshakable purpose. The neighbors called him the mill fool. The consensus was settled. The strange Scotsman and his family would not survive a Wisconsin winter in a stone silo. What did this Scottish millwright, a man who thought in circles and cycles, understand about the physics of thermal mass that a county full of experienced, right-angled builders had completely missed? This story is about more than an unusual house. It's about a different way of seeing the world, and how an understanding of ancient principles can solve the most brutal of modern problems. I promise you that by the end of this, you will understand the profound, elegant science of how a 4-foot stone wall can become a battery for heat. Subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments, what's the most unconventional home you've ever seen? Callum Drake was not a carpenter. He was not a farmer, nor was he a frontiersman trained in the art of the broadaxe and the adze. He was a millwright from the banks of the River Tay, a man whose hands understood the language of dressed stone, cast-iron gears, and the immense, slow-turning energy of water. His life had been spent not inside the flimsy warmth of wooden homes, but within the deep, resonant permanence of stone mills. He knew the feel of a wall that had been absorbing the friction heat from a spinning drive shaft for 50 years. He knew how a limestone block, cool to the touch at dawn, could radiate a gentle, persistent warmth long after the sun had set. He understood that stone wasn't just a barrier, it was a vessel. He and his wife Elspeth and their 2 small children, Ian and Morag, had arrived in Wisconsin the previous autumn, drawn by the promise of land and the clear, powerful water of the Kickapoo. Their first winter in a hastily built frame cabin had been a lesson in utter misery. It was a lesson taught by the laws of thermodynamics, written on their very skin. Callum remembered the day the iron gate latch, supercooled by the night air, pulled a patch of skin clean off his bare palm. He remembered the coiling rope to the woodpile, which by dusk had absorbed so much freezing moisture from the air that it was glazed stiff as an iron pipe, a useless, frozen snake. Their neighbor's ox, a beast of profound and simple wisdom, had refused to enter its own barn for 9 straight days, preferring the lee of a snowdrift to the deep, penetrating cold of the structure. Inside their own cabin, life had shrunk to a small circle around the stove. Elspeth spent her days feeding it, a relentless, hungry god that devoured split oak and gave back only a temporary, localized warmth. 3 feet from the stove, you were sweating. 6 feet away, you could see your breath. At night, they slept in their coats under a mountain of blankets, and still woke to a film of ice inside the water bucket. The cold was not an enemy at the door. It was a guest at the table, an occupant of every corner. Callum watched, and he learned. The problem wasn't the fire. The problem was the house. The conventional cabins that dotted the Kickapoo Valley were marvels of frontier ingenuity, but they were thermal failures. They were built to be barriers, not reservoirs. A typical wall was 6 to 8 inches of hewn log, with the gaps chinked with mud, moss, or whatever else came to hand. This assembly had an R value, a measure of thermal resistance that was shockingly low. The immense heat generated by a wood stove measured in British thermal units, or BTUs, would hit these thin walls and pass straight through them, radiating out into the frozen landscape. The heat went in one side of the log and out the other in a matter of minutes. The result was a brutal cycle of consumption. A family like the Jorgensens, neighbors a quarter-mile downriver, would burn through a full cord of seasoned oak every 2 weeks during the deep winter. That was a stack of wood 4 feet high, 4 feet wide, and 8 feet long. It represented days of hard labor with the axe and saw, all to generate heat that their house was incapable of holding. The air inside their cabin was a frantic battle between 2 opposing forces, the stove producing thousands of BTUs per hour, and the walls and windows losing them just as fast. This created enormous temperature gradients. The air by the ceiling could be 80 degrees Fahrenheit, while the floor remained near freezing. Cold air would pour down the exterior walls and pool in the corners, creating zones of stagnant, bitter chill. It was in these corners that mold grew, that dampness collected, and that the children, huddled closer to the fire, would inevitably catch their winter coughs. The very design was the flaw. A square creates 4 corners, 4 points, where thermal energy is most rapidly lost. It was a geometry of inefficiency. These cabins were like trying to carry water in a sieve. No matter how much you poured in, it was gone almost instantly. The settlers fought this reality with the only tool they had, more fuel. They burned through their wood piles with a desperate intensity, clear-cutting the surrounding hillsides to feed the insatiable appetite of their thermally useless homes. They were locked in a constant, exhausting war against the cold, a war their houses were designed to lose. Callum Drake, watching this struggle, knew he would not fight that war. He would not build a sieve. He would build a jug. His work at the old mill was methodical, a slow act of transformation. First came the cleaning. For weeks, he shoveled out the compacted debris of decades, rotted grain, chaff, the nests of raccoons and owls, and a thick layer of dust that rose in ghostly clouds in the shafts of autumn light. He swept the stone walls clean, revealing the craftsmanship of the original masons. The 30-foot diameter cylinder was nearly perfect, a testament to forgotten skills. Then came the plaster. Ferris Oldknow had been right about one thing. Porous limestone would indeed wick moisture. But Callum wasn't using the common mud and straw daub of the frontier. He had spent a small fortune to have barrels of hydraulic lime, shipped by rail and wagon. It was a material he knew from his work on Scottish seawalls and canal locks. Unlike regular lime plaster, which cures by exposure to air, hydraulic lime sets through a chemical reaction with water. It becomes, in essence, a thin layer of waterproof stone. It was expensive, and the labor was immense. For over a month, he worked his way around the vast interior curve. He mixed the plaster in a wooden trough, the consistency of thick porridge, and applied it with a steel trowel. Scrape, press, smooth, scrape, press, smooth. Elspeth and the children helped, carrying buckets of sand from the riverbank and water from the well. He filled every crack, every void, sealing the ancient stone against the coming damp. The interior surface became a seamless, gently curved wall of pale gray, smooth to the touch. It was no longer a ruin. It was a vessel being prepared. His next act was even more baffling to onlookers. He did not build a fireplace against the wall, as any sane man would. A fireplace, with its massive chimney, was a notorious heat thief, pulling more warm air out of a room than it radiated back in. Instead, he cleared the very center of the 30-foot circle. There, half buried in the earthen floor, was the original runner stone from the grist mill, a massive disk of granite 5 feet across. He excavated around it, leveled it, and mortared it into place. This became his hearth. Upon this ancient stone, he would build his fire. A simple iron smoke pipe, thin and efficient, would run straight up and out through a protected hole in the new roof he was building. The living quarters were built last. He erected a simple, 2-story wooden structure inside the stone cylinder. It was a house within a house, its posts and beams standing a full foot away from the plastered stone wall, never touching it. This created a continuous 30-inch air gap between the wooden living space and the stone shell. The ground floor was a single large room for cooking and living, and a steep ladder stair led to a loft for sleeping. The entire wooden frame was an island, independent of the stone that surrounded it. Ferris Oldknow returned in late November, just as the first snows began to fly. He was accompanied by 2 other settlers, Silas Croft and Jebediah Stone, men whose opinions carried weight in the valley. They saw the finished work, the tidy roof, the smoke curling from the central pipe, the new windows set deep into the 4-foot-thick walls. "Living in a silo, Dreich?" Croft chuckled, shaking his head. Oldknow walked around the interior, his boots echoing on the new wooden floor. He ran a hand over the smooth, cool plaster. He was a professional, and his skepticism was rooted in experience. "I'll give you this, it's well-made foolishness," he conceded. "But my original assessment stands. The damp will come. That floor will be slick with green mold by May. You've built yourself a beautiful circular root cellar." He stamped a boot for emphasis. "And with no proper fireplace, you'll freeze sure as sin once the real cold hits. That little stovepipe can't heat a space this big. It defies sense." Callum was banking the fire on the millstone hearth. The flames licked around a stack of oak logs, casting a warm, dancing light across the curved walls. He looked at the 3 men, their faces etched with sincere concern and a touch of pity. "The stone will keep us," he said simply, and closed the flue on his smoke pipe, just enough to slow the burn. The physics of Callum Dreich's mill house was a masterclass in heat storage and transfer, a science he knew not from books, but from a lifetime of sensory experience. The principle was thermal mass, and its most important property was lag. Imagine a standard log cabin wall, 8 inches thick. A log has very little mass and very little insulating value. When you start a fire, the heat energy, the BTUS, radiates outward. It strikes the interior of the log wall, excites the wood molecules, and they quickly transfer that energy to the molecules on the outside of the wall, where it escapes into the minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit air. The lag time, the time it takes for heat to travel through the wall, is measured in minutes. Now imagine Callum's wall, 4 feet or 48 inches of solid limestone, plastered on the inside with dense hydraulic lime. Limestone is a rock with enormous thermal mass. It weighs roughly 160 pounds per cubic foot. A single square foot of his wall, 4 feet deep, weighed over 600 pounds. The entire 30-foot diameter cylinder contained hundreds of tons of rock. When Callum built his fire on the central millstone hearth, it radiated heat in all directions. This radiant energy, traveling as infrared waves, struck the entire 360-degree surface of the interior wall simultaneously. But unlike the log wall, the stone did not pass the heat through quickly. It absorbed it. It was like pouring water into a massive dry sponge. For the first hour, the interior surface of the stone would warm. For the next several hours, that heat would slowly, molecule by molecule, soak deeper into the 4-foot thickness of the limestone. Callum would run a strong, hot fire for about 8 hours a day, 4 in the morning, 4 in the evening. During this time, he was not just heating the air in the room. He was charging the stone battery that surrounded his family. After 8 hours of direct heating, the first few inches of the limestone would be quite warm, and the heat would have penetrated deep into the wall's core. When he banked the fire for the night, the process reversed. The air in the room would begin to cool, but the tons of warmed limestone would now begin to release their stored energy. The wall itself became the radiator. For the next 16 hours, it would steadily and gently radiate heat back into the living space. The lag was the key. It took 8 hours to charge the battery, and it took twice that long for it to discharge. The cylindrical geometry was the second stroke of genius. In a square house, corners are thermal weak points. They have more exterior surface area than interior surface area, causing heat to bleed away faster. They are also difficult for radiant and convective heat to reach, but a circle has no corners. Every point on the interior surface of Callum's home could see every other point. The heat radiating from one part of the wall would travel across the space and be absorbed by the opposite wall. The warmth was distributed with perfect mathematical uniformity. There were no cold spots. There was no place for damp, chilled air to pool and stagnate. The entire living space was wrapped in a continuous, seamless, gently radiating blanket of warmth. It was a system of profound elegance, powered by a small fire and a massive stone flywheel. That winter, the driftless area of Wisconsin fell into the grip of an ice siege. It was not a winter of dramatic blizzards and howling winds, but something far more insidious. For 9 straight days, a dense, supercooled fog settled over the valleys. The temperature dropped to 26 degrees below zero and stayed there, locked in a breathless, crystalline stillness. There was no sun. The world was rendered in shades of gray and white. Every surface facing the faint ambient light of the sky grew a thick coating of rime ice, feathery and sharp. Trees looked like they were made of glass. The very air seemed to crackle with cold. For the settlers in their conventional cabins, it was a period of intense suffering. The Jorgensens burned through their remaining woodpile at a terrifying rate. Mr. Jorgensen spent his days wrapped in everything he owned, swinging an axe in the frozen woods, the impacts sounding brittle and sharp in the still air. Inside, his wife and children never left the single room with the stove, feeding it constantly. Yet the windows remained opaque with a thick layer of frost on the inside. Water left for more than an hour away from the stove became slush, then solid ice. At Silas Croft's homestead, the nails in the walls contracted in the cold, creating a network of tiny, invisible drafts. At night, they could hear the house groaning and popping, the wood fibers shrieking in protest. They woke each morning exhausted. The fire having died to coals, the room plunged into a cold so deep it felt like it was inside their bones. This was the reality of the thermal sieve, a home that could only offer warmth under constant, frantic effort. Inside Callum Drake's stone circle, life continued with an almost unnerving normalcy. The 8-hour charging cycle of the fire, split between morning and evening, was more than enough. When the fire was banked for the long 16-hour night, the great stone wall took over. The interior temperature never dropped below 65 degrees. The air was still and calm, with no drafts to gutter the lamp flame. Elspeth sat in a simple wooden chair, mending one of Ian's shirts, her fingers nimble and sure. The cold had not stiffened them. The children, Ian and Morag, sat on a rug on the wooden floor, drawing on a slate with a piece of chalk. They were in their shirt sleeves. The air smelled not of wood smoke and damp wool, but of the stew simmering over the coals and the faint, clean scent of the lime plaster. The ultimate proof of this alternate reality sat on a small wooden shelf Callum had built into the inner wooden wall. It was a simple glass jar of ink and a quill pen. Every other inkwell in the Kickapoo Valley had frozen solid by January, the iron gall ink expanding and sometimes shattering the bottles. To write a letter was impossible, but here, in the gentle, radiant warmth of the mill house, the ink remained perfectly, miraculously liquid. One evening, as the rime ice thickened on the world outside, Callum sat at his small table. He dipped the pen into the jar, and it came out laden with dark, fluid ink. He wrote a letter to his brother back in Scotland, the pen scratching quietly on the paper, a sound of impossible civilization in the heart of the great, frozen siege. The vindication came on the 7th day of the siege. Ferris Oldknow needed to check on a family up the valley and was leading his big draft horse along the river track. The ground, coated in days of frozen fog, was a sheet of treacherous glaze ice. As he passed the hulking gray cylinder of the old mill, the horse, despite its caulked shoes, lost its footing. Its legs splayed, and with a panicked snort, the 1,000-pound animal went down on its side. Oldknow, thrown off balance, stumbled and slid toward the mill. He put out a hand to steady himself against the massive stone wall, bracing for the brutal, searing cold he knew would come from contact with frozen rock. His mind was prepared for a pain that could freeze skin in seconds. He expected a shock of Arctic cold. What he felt was nothing. There was no cold. Confused, he pressed his gloved palm flat against the limestone. Through the thick leather he could feel it. A deep, resonant, impossible warmth. It wasn't hot, not like a stove. It was a living warmth, a presence in the stone. He stared at his hand, then at the wall, his mind struggling to reconcile the sensation with a lifetime of experience. He pulled off his glove, the minus 26 degrees Fahrenheit air biting at his exposed skin, and placed his bare palm flat against the rough limestone. The shock that came was not of cold, but of a gentle, life-affirming heat. The stone was warmer than the air. It was warmer than his own freezing hand. In that instant, the reality of what Callum Drake had done crashed down upon him. The cold of the world stopped where this wall began. The assessor stood there for a full minute, his bare hand pressed against the stone, the freezing fog swirling around him, his face a portrait of shattered certainty. He secured his horse, which had struggled back to its feet, and walked to the mill's new wooden door. He knocked. Callum opened it, and a wave of calm, still warmth washed over Oldknow, a physical shock after the biting cold. He stepped inside. The air was fresh and dry. He saw the children playing on the floor. He saw Elspeth humming as she stirred a pot. He saw the even, shadowless light from the lamps. There was no roaring fire, only a bed of glowing coals on the central hearth. He looked around the vast, curved space, his assessor's mind trying to compute the physics of it. He saw the ink jar on the shelf. "Drake," he said, his voice husky with awe. He walked over to the jar, picked it up, and tilted it. The black ink swirled, liquid and free. He looked back at the quiet Scotsman. Every document in my office is unsignable. The ink is a rock in the bottle. How? Callum simply gestured to the wall that encircled them. The stone, he said. Oldknow looked from the ink to the wall, and then to the small bed of coals. He finally understood. The fire wasn't heating the house. The fire was heating the wall, and the wall was heating the house. It was a slow, massive, and unstoppable system. He shook his head, a slow smile of comprehension spreading across his face. "You didn't build a house, Dreich," Ferris Oldknow said, his voice filled with a reverence that bordered on disbelief. "You built a slow sun." Ferris Oldknow, a man respected for his pragmatism and adherence to facts, became the Dreich principle's most fervent advocate. His amended assessment of the property, filed with the county clerk, was less a tax document and more a treatise on thermal dynamics. He described the cylindrical mass design in painstaking detail, noting the fuel efficiency, the uniform temperature, and the complete lack of dampness. The story spread. It was too strange, too dramatic to remain local. A traveling correspondent for the Prairie Farmer magazine, in the area to report on crop yields, heard the tale of the mill fool who had bested the ice siege. He interviewed Oldknow, who eagerly transcribed the principles. He spent an afternoon with Callum, measuring temperatures, sketching the layout, and marveling at the liquid ink. The resulting article, published the following spring, was titled "A Stone Battery for Winter, a Wisconsin Millwright's Innovation in Thermal Storage." The idea, now codified and explained, began to take root. It was not the novelty of living in a mill that captured people's imaginations, but the underlying principle of thermal mass. That summer, 3 different farmers in the driftless area with old stone barns, structures previously considered useful only for livestock and hay, began renovations. They gutted the lofts, replastered the interiors with lime mortar, and built small, independent wooden living structures inside the stone shells. They were adapting the principle to their own circumstances. The Dreich house was no longer an anomaly. It was a prototype. By the following winter, these families were reporting fuel savings of over 70%. The knowledge spread from farmer to farmer, a practical gospel of warmth and efficiency passed along not by architects, but by the testimony of those who had survived the winter in unprecedented comfort. What Callum Dreich accomplished on the banks of the Kickapoo River was more than just a clever bit of frontier engineering. He was, without knowing it, a pioneer of modern building science. The principles he applied intuitively are now at the heart of passive solar design, high-mass construction, and energy-efficient architecture. His radiant heating system, with the wall itself as the emitter, anticipated modern radiant floor and wall systems by nearly a century. The concept of the thermal battery, storing energy from a cheap or intermittent source to be released later, is a cornerstone of sustainable design today. He demonstrated that a building's envelope could be more than a simple barrier between inside and out. It could be an active, dynamic system for managing energy. He was a man with old-world knowledge who saw a new-world problem not as a wall to be battered down, but as a current to be harnessed. There is a profound lesson in the circular walls of Callum Dreich's home. The other settlers, in their square cabins, built to fight the cold. They drew a line, a right angle, and declared inside warm and outside cold, and spent all their energy defending that line. Theirs was a geometry of opposition. Every other man built 4 walls and left cold a corner to work from, a place where the damp would gather and the chill would pool. The fight was constant because the design was flawed. Callum built differently because he thought differently. He did not see the cold as an enemy to be fought, but as a condition to be managed. He built one wall and curved it, creating a space with no weaknesses, no corners, for the cold to conquer. His was a geometry of inclusion. He invited the heat into the very fabric of his home, letting the stone absorb, hold, and then give back the warmth. He created not a fortress, but a flywheel, a system that worked in harmony with the natural cycles of heating and cooling. He showed his neighbors that the greatest strength wasn't in resistance, but in resilience, not in fighting the elements, but in understanding and embracing their fundamental physics. Thank you for joining us for this story of frontier ingenuity. If you found this exploration of thermal mass fascinating, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more stories of forgotten wisdom. Let us know in the comments, what modern technologies can you think of that rely on this same ancient principle of the thermal battery? The information presented in this video is for educational and storytelling purposes, inspired by historical practices and principles. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are fictionalized for narrative effect. The techniques described are based on real historical building methods, but any modern application should be undertaken with professional guidance and in accordance with current building codes, safety standards, and local regulations. This content does not constitute professional engineering, architectural, or legal advice.